Okay, Jack. So here's the first question. Parts seem to conflict, and here's the conflict. Community-based evidence
programs, culturally based programs, are accessible by the tribes who have been approved for direct 4E funding, but not accessible for state tribes who are going through tribal state agreements. And they come to that interpretation based upon where some of the provisions are in the statute. Right now, if you look at the overall legislative history, I'm not sure Congress really intended to make it that narrow, right? But the way Congress actually drafted the statute, I can see why they might read it that way. And so that's the operative interpretation now, that tribe has to be direct funded to access those community-based programs. So HHS or ACYF is not actually approving those programs in the same way that they're approving programs on the clearinghouse. They're not reviewing them and approving them across the board. What they're doing is, the states that are direct funded are including them in their Family First prevention plans. And then they are, signing off on those as they sign off on the plans, right? But each submission is individualized to that particular tribe. Now, actually, tribes have some programs, for instance, positive Indian parenting is an example, right? Which each tribe tailors to its own tribal needs and culture. But it's a national program, but we're seeing tribes come in and say, well, we run positive Indian parenting. We've tweaked it with our culture. We call it X. And they're saying that's okay. So in a sense, they are bringing in some nationally recognized program as culturally based programs through that door, although some of them are very unique programs to those particular tribes as well. But even though they're getting approved in those plans, that doesn't make them broadly applicable and approved for everybody, because it's not like there's a community-based evidence clearinghouse, right? That doesn't exist, and in fact, I think tribes don't want that to exist, honestly. Now, there have been discussions about that all tribes really ought to be able to access those programs, and actually in the budget proposals of both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, HHS has said we would support legislative changes that would allow that. And Senator Murkowski from Alaska at one point was drafting a bill based on requests from Alaska tribes, but nothing has ever been introduced. And so, whether that will actually happen or not, nobody knows. Even though there seems to be wide support for it, as many of you know, that's not enough necessarily to get something passed into law. It requires somebody to really make it their initiative and push it and all of that. And so far that hasn't happened. But if it does, then that would be a game changer for tribes who are accessing it through the state.
Okay. And so let's just stay there with the tribes that are accessing the funding through the state. How does could or should the tribe get the state to amend its plan?
Well, I mean, if a tribe is going to be signing an agreement with the state, then it ought to be, as part of those negotiations, the state would hopefully understand that in order to implement it, they have to modify their plan. I don't think state plan amendments are going to be anywhere as difficult as the initial submissions, right? Because it's really just adding at this point, right, given that tribes can't access the culturally based programs through the state, it's just going to be adding an evidence-based program on the clearinghouse list, essentially. Now, there is another mechanism in the Family First law that if a program isn't on the list, that the state can submit data sufficient to allow the feds to say, well, even though it's not on the list, you submit enough data that we're going to allow you to do it until the actual program has been reviewed. But at this point, I'm guessing that's that would be a big lift. And I'm guessing, stage one of this would be more the smaller lift, where a tribe is saying, we already do motivational interviewing. and we really want to get reimbursed for that, right? And it's on the list, and if it's not one of the services that California has included in its plan, then it would need to modify that. I have not seen the California plan, so I don't know if there's language in there about tribes and tribal state agreements already. There ought to be.
There is.
Because they say they have a couple of agreements, so they ought to have put it in there at least to allow those two tribes to modify their agreements and implement family first if they want to, right? I mean, that's good. But basically, if that's already in there, all they'd have to do is modify it to add the additional programs if it's not one of the programs the state's already recognizing. And if it's a program that isn't well supported, there'd be some evaluation issues, they might have to need to address in that too. But I don't think that amendment process will be terribly difficult. It should be, and the state should understand that as they're negotiating with tribes, I would think.
Got it. And really, I'm going to throw in a question sort of relevant to this, but it's not EBP. That's not an EBP question. Okay. It's a question about, for those states, I don't know if you've seen, for those states who are electing to have community pathways, right? And what in terms of candidacy determination, right? Is there what are some of the issues you've been seeing around how tribes are wanting to interact with the candidacy process, best folks that are doing it well, some things to watch out for, anything around there? You should understand, I mean, tribes at this point are, there's been very little activity around family first with tribes. And I think it's other than the direct funded tribes, there's been several plans submitted by them and a couple approved. So, there's energy there, but at the state level, there has not been a lot of energy. And I think it's because of the limitations on the programs that, tribes are able to fund through family first. So I don't know that we can really point to a track record at this point. I think everybody's about at the same place California is. The discussions are just kind of starting to happen. Tribes, I think a lot of tribes, just like a lot of the people on these calls, don't really understand family first and how it works. So there's a real education process and even understanding what it does. I think tribes who know about family first start talking, and they have taught, and there have been discussions in a number of states, Alaska and some others, Minnesota, about this. But I think tribes start from the place of, well, we want to run culturally based programming. And then when they kind of say, well, we really can't do that yet, then some of it's sort of, the level of interest is not as high. So I think this is just a learning process for everybody. I think tribes are still getting educated about it. One of the things we try to talk about when we talk with tribes is, just think about small steps on this, right? If there's one program you're running that could be reimbursable, just start there. It doesn't have to be, a big elaborate process. And so I think that's likely the way, as this gets off the ground, this might happen. But I know the whole issue about candidacy, right? Isn't that, like, for the community pathway, isn't that the one thing that the state or the county has to retain control over, right? Everything else they're kind of saying they'll let them do through the community pathway, but that candidacy determination, they're not. And I do think that that's a tricky thing here. Before now, it's not tricky in a situation where the child's under the custody of the county, right? I mean, I think it's not as tricky there. If we're trying to also get these services to kids who are under the custody of the tribe, then it gets much trickier because the tribe isn't really going to want to delegate that. But I think that's where, the way to do that is going to be through an agreement. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that's probably the reason to try to do it through an agreement, because that way the tribe, you can create it so that they can do the candidacy, because they're coming in, as a government through a government to government agreement. If it's through the community pathway, it does get more complicated. I don't know what you all are thinking about what the role of the community organizations will be in the candidacy process, right? I don't know if they're going to do all the work and it's just at the end somebody has to sign off on it. I mean, if that's kind of the process, maybe, you could work out something that the tribe would be comfortable with, but it is kind of tricky because then it does sort of get into sovereignty issues if the state is making that determination for a child under tribal custody. But I think a lot of what the counties will be looking at is servicing populations within that are children who are in their custody and families whose children are in their custody, or not even in their custody, because family first right is pre-custody. That's the wrong terminology. But children who are under their jurisdiction, right, who aren't living on tribal territory, they're living in a part of the county that isn't directly under the tribe's jurisdiction. And so for those children, that's a whole nother situation. And you still may want to find a way, if the tribe in fact has culturally relevant services, to find a way to contract for that outside of Family First directly, or even if there's a Family First service that they're providing, maybe there's a way that you can have an agreement that allows for that, for those children who are under the county's jurisdiction to get services. And there, I think you don't get into an issue with candidacy so much, because clearly that's legitimate for the county there to make that determination.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a scenario where there's a community-based provider that here's a child, right? And oh wait, that came through the door of a family resource center or some other service like that, and this is we wonder, oh wait a minute, this might be one of those children you just talked about. They don't live under the custody of the tribe, but wait a minute, they are a member. Now what? And I think that's going to be that's the tricky area. Is that then what is the CBO supposed to do when they run into that inquiry?
Well, don't forget. I mean, these children. I do start with at the point where these children are citizens of the state of California, right? So I mean, they go into that CBO. They're still entitled to get any of the services any other child would. So the question is though, can you create a mechanism to get them some additional services that would be specifically relevant to them,
yes,
right? That you wouldn't otherwise have available. That's kind of what you're trying to do. But I think, to the extent you have services available, they still should have access to those. And keep in mind, and I know we're focused on tribes, but keep in mind, some places you do have urban Indian organizations, or at least non-tribal Indian organizations. I don't know if they're always urban, and they can be in a position to also be part of the community pathway and providing services in the same way other community organizations are. Yeah. So, and that's a mechanism that's used in a lot of places where there are, because in a lot of places there are members of many tribes that live there, right? And so these sort of intertribal, non-tribal Native organizations are the entity that's often most appropriate for a lot of those folks.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. There's a sub question sort of in this area around, does this process, the way this is working, further disengage or marginalize tribes? I mean, I suspect the answer is it could, but if you could just say something about that, that'd be great.
No, it's certainly, I mean, you can just hear through the whole conversation, right? I mean, it's you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole to some extent, right? Because tribes have sovereignty, and they are very protective of that, as they should be. But by the same token, everybody has an interest in making sure that the children and families get the best services they can. And so how you, and if this were structured intelligently, it would make it easy. It would recognize that tribes are governments, and so you have to do things a little differently. And here's how, and we're authorizing that. Here it is. So don't worry about any of these other rules. But unfortunately, it's just not that. Yeah, it's not that. Yeah, they haven't made it that simple, and so there's the risk of marginalizing tribes, of course. But I do think it sort of depends on how you engage. I mean, as long as you're acknowledging up front that that these complexities are there, you're acknowledging up front the understanding that that they have sovereignty, they are a sovereign government, and that's something that you want to be sure to respect. Then it'd be, if you can get sort of engaged on that level, and the question, you sort of have respectful problem solving type relationships, then hopefully tribes don't feel marginalized. But there's the potential for that, right? If somebody even inadvertently just doesn't really get some of the nuances, and they're just kind of lumping tribes into some big stakeholder pod, and and sort of acting that way, then tribes can certainly feel like they're not being, that their status is not being properly respected, and that the program is not really being inclusive in terms of in the right way.
Oh, yeah. So I heard two things, at least in how can we mitigate this risk, right? It is a risk, and it will be a risk. Mitigate it first by acknowledging tribal sovereignty, right, in planning conversations, and then making sure that tribes are respected as a unique stakeholder group unto themselves, right, rather than being with very specific requirements, given they are sovereign governments, and then making sure that the conversations exist that are specific to the way tribes want to be part of this kind of planning.
And I think sometimes even the word stakeholder can be can be a red flag, right? So I think being careful about how you talk about it can be helpful.
Right. Thank you, Jack. There's another question that I'll answer for posterity, even though we don't have somebody asking a small county question. But the question is that some of the training guides or examples, it would be helpful to have training guides or examples on how small or rural counties might be able to approach comprehensive planning. And that is duly noted. And just like when we're thinking about our tools and our implementation guides, we've made a very specific. It's one of our mandates to think through how's this going to land with regard to tribal needs, like whatever it is we're saying about implementation. How is it going to also land with regard to how small or rural counties might need to approach it? So, for example, if you're thinking about building your team and your governance structure, in a large county, you likely have governance, an overarching governance body like a prevention cabinet or a 2083 group. But that group is likely not going to be doing week-to-week implementation work. But in a small county, they might, right? So in a small county, your governance oversight group and your implementation team might be one and the same. And in a large county, they may not. So we will, as we're unveiling tools, we will try and ensure that if there are adaptations that we are recommending, or just lines of inquiry that we're recommending, that might have different considerations if you're a smaller rural county, we will point those out. And I wouldn't give up on the idea of having some very focused small county conversations coming. So, that is particularly in 2023, as we get into some of the details of implementation, and we talk to consultants who small counties may have hired, smaller rural counties may have hired. We might be adding to the tools with regard to some of the feedback that we're hearing there. But there absolutely are different considerations. I just named one with regard to governance. with regard to, well, you know, just your capacity to do the analyses that are required, right? You know, larger counties have these gigantic data shops that can churn out data. Well, how can you do it? In some ways, unified county data is easier to get in a small county, but you know, there have to be people to process those data. There are regionalization considerations for small counties, right? To, you know, many of them share providers across county lines. So are there ways folks can regionalize so they can tap their providers in a consistent way? So that's another consideration that a large county like Los Angeles or San Diego would need to think about. And then you being able to regionalize and use regional training academies to then provide small counties with forums and special trainings might be another avenue to look into, is tapping into the RTA regions. So those are some of the things that I would say. And I just really appreciate the question, and whoever raised it, if you're watching the recording, keep raising it, because we want to make sure that this isn't all about, you know, your zip code or the county you live in shouldn't mean you get better or less quality prevention services. All right. Well, I think that's sort of the bulk of what we wanted to talk about. I don't know, Jack, if you have any parting words for folks about, you know, things to do, especially with regard to the context of this discussion, which is building governance, right? Now, as you've talked about acknowledging sovereignty, and there may not be, but if you have any last words, this would be the time for them.
Just a couple of things, I guess, that as you were talking that occurred to me. You know, one way to think of, you know, when your counties are talking to each other about how to regionalize or work together, or coordinate around providers, whatever, right? And they sort of automatically, they know they're having this conversation, right, between two governments, two county governments.
Yes.
If you think about tribes the same way, right, that kind of is helpful. The other thing is, you know, as I think about small counties with limited resources, I mean, that's where, at least in some places, that tribal relationship can be so important, because the tribe may really have resources to put on the table. Now, you know, it varies tremendously. We know some tribes have very few resources, but we also know some tribes have been fairly successful with gaming or other things like that, and they have resources that dwarf the county's resources, or at least rival the county's resources. So another sort of reason to think about why you want to engage with tribes is to kind of deal with some of the shortcomings that rural kind of counties may have because of a smaller scale and you know, fewer resources.
Wow, yeah, I hadn't actually thought about it that way, which is like, if you have even one tribe that resides within your county area, you are looking at a regionalized approach, right? Because that's another sovereign entity there that you might be sharing providers with, for example, even though geographically they're located inside your county line, so to speak. So that's a really, really great context. We had somebody join us, so I want to make sure that if they have a question, we do spend our last 3 minutes answering it. You don't have to, you may be just here to listen, but Sarah Downer, did you have a specific question?
Nope, I was just here to listen.
Okay. Well,
Sorry.
Go ahead, Stephanie, please.
Based on our conversation, I just had a few follow-up questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are our tribes going to, I mean, to me, we're looking at two different structures here. Tribes that are going to be able to participate as a Title IV agency, and then tribes that may or may not have children that end up community pathway or any other way coming in to the system and being evaluated to be eligible. Now, our plan has one EBP, Healthy Families America, where it's actually been modified and adapted to meet some tribal cultural needs. But as far as evidence-based practices for tribes that want to be a Title IV agency, Are there regulations federally about whether there's exemptions for those? I heard you mention part of something about that, Jack.
Your question is a little fuzzy to me. So I mean, are you referring to tribes that are coming in for direct federal funding, or tribes that are coming in through these tribal state agreements?
I'm not sure. Kush, do you know what
Yeah,
the
so the
difference would be?
scenario, what's the scenario? The scenario is, so it's not Kuruk or Yurok, right? Those are our
Right.
two, they have state agreements.
Right.
It's tribes that are not Kuruk or Yurok, that, let's say there's a tribe that resides in Humboldt County, that is concentrated in Humboldt County. Somebody could probably name one. So
One of the state tribes is actually in Humboldt, so that might be a bad example.
Oh,
Like Tulare,
okay.
Tulare has the Tule tribe.
Okay, great. So
Yeah.
there. So in that's the scenario, is Tulare County, and the tribe that. So I think that's what Stephanie, you're talking about. Is what about what does Tulare County now do? So is that accurate? Is that the scenario, Stephanie?
yes. Well, I'm wondering it both ways, I guess. But either or. So is there any point where a tribe's a culturally relevant EVP of a tribe is going to be exempt from the clearinghouse?
Going to be exempt from, I'm sorry, what was
The
last word?
clearinghouse from
From needing to go through the clearinghouse.
If it's being done through the state plan, or through the county, implementing the state plan at the county level, they're still bound by the clearinghouse list, unless, I said, there is this other mechanism which is more complicated, but it is there, where states can submit evidence and say, yes, you haven't reviewed this yet, but here's the evidence, here's evidence sufficient for you to sort of agree on an interim basis you're going to fund it until it's been reviewed. And I think the state of Washington was thinking about doing that at one point for some culturally based programming. I'm not sure that, however, that they ever did.
Yeah. And it's so, I think once you start dipping your toe into that approval process for the prevention clearinghouse, you jump back. The water's pretty cold. Folks pull their toe out real fast.
But
Yeah,
you are
there's
correct that there are some
research methods and
right, that there are some evidence-based programs that have sort of been used in with Native American populations, with the tweets for Native American populations that are on the list. I mean, there aren't a lot of them, but there are some. And depending on how you count it, probably 6 or 7 that I know of that fall in that category. And once that is specifically culturally based, and that's family spirit. And so but I think that's where you would still, for family first purposes, you would still need to be on a clearinghouse list. Now, obviously, and I think I discussed this during my presentation last time, is there's, as money starts coming back from Family First, there's nothing to stop anybody from taking some of that money and contracting or re-signing agreements to fund programs that aren't Family First programs, right? I mean, when that money comes back to you, it's your money to use as you choose to use it. It doesn't have to only be used for Family First programs that aren't been approved under Family First. So that's another way to sort of do this once the money starts, flowing.